Hi, welcome to the current events section of the European Financial Markets course. This is week 9, and I thought what we would do for our current events is focus on the Coronabond debate. This is a debate that that has come up intensely over the last couple of weeks and is dominating the Italian news in an odd sort of way when you think about the kind of issues that we face, why this is so important. So I think there are 5 questions for us to consider. I'm going to start the timer so that I don't get carried away. Done. So I don't get carried away, and we're gonna look at 5 questions. Why is the debate coming up now? Why are we talking about this at this particular point in time? How is this Eurobond debate different from previous Eurobond debates? Why is the debate so controversial? What are the possible implications? And this is the part that I think is actually most important for us to think about, is how do we steer this in the right direction, right? Because there is a right direction, I believe, and we just got to convince people to head that way. All right, why is this coming up now? Look, this global pandemic is going to cost a shocking amount of money, right? The $2.2 trillion package that was just passed in the United States is one illustration, but you think about it, the Italians have already talked about throwing 50 billion euros at this problem, and they've only just a few weeks into it, right? And this could last months. So 50 billion euros is a lot of money for Italy. It's a 1.8 trillion euro economy. So every 18 trillion euros is 1% of GDP. And, how many percentages of GDP do we have to spend? The problem is that different countries have different access to credit markets. It's not as easy for Italy to borrow as it is for Germany to borrow, for example. But all European Union member states are in this crisis together, right? It's not as though the Germans are any less human than the Italians and therefore any more invulnerable to this horrible virus. And it's not as though anyone in Northern Europe is going to be unaffected by the economic fallout of this crisis. Everybody is in this crisis together. And so we need to figure out some way to give everybody an equal access to credit. Now, this is a challenging argument to make. It was made originally by 9 countries centered on France, Italy, and Spain, but including much of the southwestern European periphery. It now extends to 14 countries because the Baltic states have joined, Slovakia has joined, and I believe Cyprus has joined, or Cyprus was one of the original 9. In any event, the number of countries that have joined into this conversation is large, and the number of countries that are resisting it basically boils down to Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and Austria. So we need to figure out why they're being so reticent. If that doesn't add up to 19, it's because Malta is still sitting on the fence. Well, how is this different from previous debates about Eurobonds? First, the previous debate was about market discipline and risk-free assets. In other words, it was about technical aspects of the market, and the underlying assumption was that past debts, so debts that countries brought into the whole innovation of Eurobonds, would be converted into Eurobonds in whole or in part, right? So there was a sense in which the sins of the past were going to be absolved by the creation of this new Eurobond instrument. But here we're only talking about writing new debt to pay for the crisis, right? In the specific proposal, and what calls it a Eurobond, is that they're going to use an agency like the European Stability Mechanism or the European Investment Bank. These are 2 of the institutions that can issue debt. We're going to use one of those 2 agencies. We're going to get them to issue debt. And then we're all going to commit to pay it back at some point in the future. But you know what? Some point in the future is going to be some point very far in the future because nobody wants to have a rollover in the middle of a crisis. So we're going to push the maturity as far out into the future as we can and use the creditworthiness of all the European Union member states to hammer down the cost of that debt pretty much as close to zero as you can get. So we're talking about basically free money that we can use to respond to this crisis. Free money that won't be a huge burden on future taxpayers and won't cause everybody to go through horrific austerity. And it wouldn't be everyone who went through horrific austerity in any event. It would only be those countries that have the most difficulty accessing credit. And crucially, the measure would be only temporary. Although I say, long maturities on the debt, the fact of the matter is that when the crisis is over, the European Investment Bank or the European Stability Mechanism won't be issuing any new Corona debt, right? The new issues will stop. And since the ECB is already committed to hold a ton of debt on its balance sheet, I suspect most of this Corona debt would end up on the balance sheet of the ECB in any event. In other words, we'd be basically issuing bonds for the ECB to hold for as long as necessary, and at some point we'll pay it back. But we wouldn't be issuing any new bonds once a crisis is passed. Then it goes back to the member states. So it's temporary and not permanent, which is very different from the original Eurobond proposal. So if it's so different, why is it so controversial? It's controversial because there's significant confusion, particularly among people who want to be confused, about the link between the past Eurobond debate and the current Eurobond debate, right? The past debate, I freely admit, was about converting existing debt. The current debate is not about that. The past debate was about creating some new institutional arrangement for the issuance and management of the debt. The current debate is not about that. It's just about giving everybody the same access to credit. But the confusion between the past debate and the current debate has made people very uncomfortable, right? And that's people who don't have a political stake in this fight. The people who do have a political stake in this fight are even more uncomfortable still, right? Consider the southern European countries. So the question is, okay, well, the European Stability Mechanism exists. All they have to do is go and ask for a line of credit from the Stability Mechanism and they'll get all the assistance they need. Well, A, you ask for a line of credit, that's a stigma, right? Then you have to show your weakness and reveal it to the world. Nobody wants that. B, if you get a line of credit from the ESM, there are conditions attached. In other words, you're told what you can do with the money and what you cannot do with the money. And these are sovereign countries. They're proud countries. They're not going to be told how to respond to the crisis. And they're not going to have somebody sit behind them and tell them what they can and cannot do. That's just insulting. Right now, what they need to focus on is just getting the job done. And for that, they need access to credit. And third, there's no way the governments in these countries would survive. The Spanish government is a minority government that's supported by regionalist parties in Catalonia that would not like this. The government in Italy is a very strange coalition between PD and Five Star Movement that's being attacked from the outside by the right-wing parties that have been campaigning aggressively and quite effectively against the idea that European institutions would impose conditionality. So there's no way that these countries can accept the stigma associated with conditional lending. They need access to credit that's unconditional, that's non-stigmatic, right? That everybody is using. And that's why the Eurobond thing solves their problem. But of course, what solves their problem creates problems for other countries. And in Northern Europe, right, the problem is that they cannot be seen, the politicians in these countries cannot be seen to be bailing out the South. They cannot be seen to be soft on fiscal irresponsibility, and they cannot be seen to encouraging moral hazard that will only create even bigger problems in the future. And when I say they cannot be seen, think about it. The largest opposition party in Germany, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, is adamantly opposed to any kind of Eurobond thing. But so is the Christian Social Union, which is the partner party or sister party to the Christian Democratic Union, which dominates the government today in this grand coalition. So the fact of the matter is the grand coalition would not be long for this life if they were seen to be joining up for something like this, right? And equally in the Netherlands, the government headed by Mark Rutte, who's a kind of a center-right liberal, is being attacked by populists much further to the right. He's got a one-seat majority in an already very fragmented parliament, and he's worried to death that defections will take away his majority, bring down his government, and it won't be possible to form another government again. So the southern countries are politically too weak to accept conditionality and the kind of lending that's available more easily through the European Stability Mechanism. The northern countries are too weak politically, and let's underscore that. It's not that they're strong, it's that they're weak. That's why this is so controversial. They're too weak politically in order to make the kind of concessions that would be necessary to allow for the creation of some kind of mutualized sovereign debt instrument. And that's if we believe that these are concessions, right? Now, the implications of this whole debate depend really whether on the two sides come to agreement. If the North agrees, then we have to be very careful about what kind of a price they have to pay in terms of domestic politics. The last thing we want to see is a hard right government in either the Netherlands or in Germany. Austria, we've already seen that. We could see it again. I haven't mentioned Sebastian Kurz, who it turns out is one of the more problematic figures in this conversation. But the last thing we need is a really aggressively hard right government in any of these countries that hates the rest of Europe and feels like they're being ripped off, right? And so if the North agrees, we have to be careful about how high a price they pay, and there has to be some way to sell this so that it's not so expensive for them. If the North refuses, we have to be careful about what the rest of Europe does, because there are three possibilities. One, not listed on the sheet, is that they just buckle down and go to the ESM and accept some light form of conditionality in quotation marks. And then we have the same problem that we have to worry about whether their governments collapse and get replaced by right-wing parties that try to pull them out of Europe. So that's one concern. The other concern is that they might just say, fine, you guys don't want to do this, we're going to do this ourselves. And they're going to build a common bond as 14 countries. And then insist that it be sold to the ECB, which creates all the same problems for Germany, but without German participation. As a matter of fact, it's even more alienating for Germany than a common Eurobond would be, where they could at least be perceived to be playing a leading role. And if you don't believe me on that point, just think about how alienating it was for Britain to be outside of the euro as a single currency. The third possibility is that the 14 countries that want this Eurobond will just drift apart and find their own way in this crisis. And Europe will be forever identified with the lack of solidarity in time of need. And that also is a very dangerous possibility. So in many respects, this is an existential debate for the whole of the European Union. Okay, so if it's an existential debate, then how do we steer this conversation in the right direction? Because there is a right direction, and that right direction just needs some appropriate framing. It's going to be hard because there are so many voices in the conversation, so many people who are going to insist strongly that only they know what they're seeing. But of course, it's really only me, and since it's all about me, we have to make sure that everybody agrees on what I'm trying to say. And so echoed this voice as far as we can. That was irony, by the way. That was me trying to be funny, and I'm not very funny. And having said that, I think we can do this by borrowing from the Getting the Yes book and focusing on principles, right? And the principles that we want to focus on, I think, are grounded in the notion of solidarity, right? This is not an engineering problem. The engineering is actually really simple. We just instruct the ESM to issue a giant bond and to generate lots of money that you give to the member states in proportion in which they either need it or they have GDP, right? You can give Germany money it doesn't need, and it can retire its own national debt in view of this Eurobond if it wants to do that. But the fact of the matter is that the engineering is not the problem, it's the principle. And the principle is the role of solidarity. And we are in an existential crisis that faces everyone with the same risk of getting this disease and dying from this disease, or suffering from the economic consequences of preventing that death. And I think the more we emphasize that aspect, and the more we make it clear that this is not about forgiving past behavior, and it's not about giving somebody a leg up, it's about making sure that we either hang together or hang separately, then I think we can begin to push this conversation in a meaningful direction. But it's going to take a lot of patient conversation, not moralizing, a lot of patient conversation to help people see that this really is an existential problem for which solidarity is the only solution, because without that solidarity, things are likely to fall apart. And if things fall apart in the European context, then the next time I start talking about European financial markets, I'm going to have to put an even stronger emphasis on the problem of financial market disintegration, right? In other words, the problems that we saw in the last current events episode will be revisited on us, but many times over in terms of their significance. Okay, this is a huge issue. It's not going to go away anytime soon. As a matter of fact, it's not due to go away for at least the next 2 weeks. So watch this space. A lot of debate is going to follow. Thanks.